Park Hyen pressed his fingers against his temples and tried to calm his nerves. The small shuttle was getting closer to the alien station, and his stomach felt like it was doing flips. Through the tiny window, he could see the massive structure, floating in space. It looked like someone had stuck a bunch of metal rings together and covered them with strange lights that pulsed like a heartbeat. "First time working with aliens?" asked Kim Nari from the seat across from him. She was the security chief, a tough woman with short black hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. Her hand rested casually on her weapon, but Hyen could tell she was alert. "Second time," Hyen said, checking his translation equipment for the 5th time. "But the first time was just talking to some friendly traders. This is ... bigger." Lee Dong, the mission leader, looked up from his tablet. He was an older man with graying hair and the calm manner of someone who had done this many times before. "Don't worry, Hyen. This is routine work. 3 alien species want to make a mining deal. They need someone to help them talk to each other. You translate, we handle the business side, everyone goes home happy." Hyen nodded and went back to studying his files. The job seemed simple enough. 3 different alien races were meeting to discuss mining rights on a dead planet. The problem was that none of them could understand each other directly. That was where he came in. The first group was called the Morgothi. They were like giant insects that talked by releasing smells and making clicking sounds with their mouths. Hyen had practiced with recorded samples, but he was still nervous about getting the clicks right. One wrong sound, and he might accidentally insult someone. The second group was the Vexhalians. They were made of living crystal and communicated by making their bodies vibrate at different frequencies. Hyen's equipment could pick up these vibrations and turn them into words, but he had never worked with crystal beings before. The third group was the strangest. The Keltari were beings made of pure energy who could project thoughts directly into electromagnetic fields. His translation matrix had special sensors to detect their communications, but the test runs had given him headaches. "How long is this supposed to take?" Hyen asked. 2 days, maybe 3, Lee Dong replied. "They argue about who gets what parts of the planet. We help them figure out a fair deal. They sign some papers, and we collect our payment." Kim Nari was staring out the window at the approaching station. "Something bothers me about this place," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" Hyen asked. She pointed at the station. "Look at those marks on the hull. Do those look like normal wear and tear to you?" Hyen squinted through the window. Now that she mentioned it, there were long scratches and gouges covering the station's surface. They were too regular to be from accidents, but too violent to be decorative. "Probably just old damage," Lee Dong said, but he was looking at the marks too now. "These neutral stations see a lot of traffic. Different species, different technologies. Bound to be some scrapes." The shuttle docked with a soft thunk, and they gathered their equipment. Hyen strapped on his translation headset and activated his portable matrix. The device hummed to life, running through its startup checks. All systems showed green. "Remember," Lee Dong said as they walked toward the airlock, "you're just here to help them talk. Don't get involved in the actual negotiations. Let us handle the politics." "Got it," Hyen said, though part of him was curious about what the aliens would be like in person. The airlock cycled, and they stepped into the station. The corridor was wide and tall, clearly built to accommodate different types of beings. The walls were a dull metallic color, and the air smelled faintly of ozone and something else Hyen couldn't identify. "This way to the meeting chamber," announced a mechanical voice from speakers in the ceiling. They followed the corridor deeper into the station. Hyen noticed more of those strange marks on the walls. Up close, they looked even more disturbing. Some of them looked almost like claw marks. But what kind of claws would be that big? "Are there any other humans on this station?" he asked. "Just us," Kim Nari replied. This is a neutral zone. No weapons except for security personnel. No military ships. No territorial claims. It's supposed to be safe. The meeting chamber was enormous, with a high domed ceiling and atmosphere controls for each species. The air was divided into sections, with different gas mixtures for different beings. Hyan set up his translation equipment at a console in the center of the room. Testing, testing, he said into his headset. The matrix responded by displaying readouts for all 3 alien languages. Everything looked normal. The aliens began arriving. One by one. The Morgothi delegate was exactly what Hyan had expected. A creature like a giant praying mantis, but with 4 arms and eyes that reflected the light like mirrors. It moved with quick, precise motions and smelled like cinnamon. And Metal Dot the Vexhalian was beautiful in an alien way. Its body was made of what looked like living diamond, constantly shifting colors as light passed through it. When it moved, it made a soft chiming sound like wind bells. The Keltari was the strangest of all. It looked like a small storm cloud that glowed with its own light. Occasionally, tiny lightning bolts would flash within its form. Hyan's sensors detected it immediately, and the translation matrix began picking up its electromagnetic communications. "Welcome, beings of distant worlds," the Keltari projected. The words appeared on Hyan's screen as he translated them aloud. "We gather to discuss the bounty of the dead world, Kepler 438c. The Morgothi clicked rapidly, and Hyan translated. "The deep core contains metals our hives require for expansion. We propose mining rights to depths below 1,000 meters." The Vexhalian's body chimed, and the translation came through as, "The crystalline formations in the upper crust are necessary for our quantum resonance research. We claim surface rights to a depth of 500 meters. This was going to be interesting, Hyan thought. Both species wanted different parts of the planet, so there shouldn't be too much conflict. The Keltari wanted something about ancient resonances, which his equipment was having trouble translating clearly. He made a note to work on that dot for the first hour. Everything went smoothly. The 3 species discussed mining techniques, timeline estimates, and profit sharing. Hyan found himself getting more comfortable with the translation work. The Morgothi delegate was actually quite polite, despite looking like something from a nightmare. The Vexhalian had a sense of humor that came through in crystalline harmonics. Even the mysterious Keltari seemed friendly enough, but as time went on, Hyan began to notice small things that bothered him. The Keltari kept mentioning awakening and feeding, but in contexts that didn't quite make sense. The Vexhalians' colors had been getting darker and more agitated, and the Morgothi had started releasing stress pheromones that made Hyan's nose itch. "Is something wrong?" he asked during a break in the negotiations. "The station," the Vexhalian chimed softly. "It feels hungry." Before Hyan could ask what that meant, the lights went out in the sudden darkness. Something began to scream. The emergency lights kicked in, painting everything in an angry red glow. Hyan's translation headset crackled with static, then suddenly exploded with noise. All 3 alien species were trying to communicate at once, but not in the calm diplomatic tones from before. The Morgothi was clicking so fast, it sounded like a machine gun. Through his headset, Hyan heard fragments. "Danger. Ancient hunters ... The Void Children wake." The Vexhalian's body was flashing between colors so quickly it hurt to look at. Its crystalline voice was shrieking at frequencies that made Hyan's ears ache and his teeth feel loose in his head. "What are they saying?" Kim Nari shouted, her weapon already in her hands. Her eyes were scanning the chamber for threats. Hyan's fingers flew over his translation controls, trying to make sense of the chaos. "They're scared," he said, blood trickling from his nose where the high-frequency sounds had hit him. "Really? Scared. The Morgothi keeps saying something about devourers and feeding time. Li Dong was backing toward the exit, his face pale. We need to get out of here, now. But when he reached the doors, they wouldn't open. He pressed the control panel again and again, but nothing happened. Then, with a sound like breaking bones, the doors sealed completely. The metal seemed to flow together like liquid, leaving no trace of an opening. That's not possible, Kim, Nari said, but she was already moving to check the other exits. They were all sealed the same way. The Keltari, which had been relatively quiet during the negotiations, suddenly blazed brighter than before. Its electromagnetic field was so strong that it made Hyan's translation equipment spark and smoke. Through the chaos of signals, he caught fragments of its communication. This was never a trade meeting, Hyan translated, his voice barely steady. This was a trap, a feeding. Feeding on what? Kim Nari demanded. Before Hyan could answer, the walls began to move. What he had thought were scratch marks started to pulse and writhe. The metal surface rippled like water, and things began to push through from the other side. At first they looked like tentacles, but as more emerged, Hyan realized they were something much worse. They were mouths. Hundreds of them, lined with teeth that gleamed weightily in the red light. And they were all turning toward the trapped beings in the center of the chamber. The station is alive. The Vexhalian managed to communicate before one of the tentacle mouths wrapped around its crystalline form. The alien's body began to crack under the pressure. Light bleeding from the fractures. Hyan stared in horror as his translation matrix picked up a new signal. A fourth language, something that definitely hadn't been in his briefing files. The sounds were wrong, like hearing music played backwards, or words spoken in a frequency that human ears weren't meant to process. But his equipment was designed to translate anything, and slowly, terrifyingly, words began to appear on his screen. Fresh minds, ... new flavors. The hunt continues ... There's something else here, Hyan said, his voice cracking. Something that's been using this station as bait. The Morgothi delegate was fighting desperately, its four arms slashing at the Morgothi approaching tentacles. Its chitinous armor sparked where the mouths tried to bite through, but there were too many of them. The legends were true. It clicked frantically. The Kethmori hunt again. What are the Kethmori? Li Dong asked, pressing himself against what he hoped was still a normal. Hyan was deep in his translation matrix now, pushing the system. Harder than it was designed to go. The alien signals were unlike anything he had ever encountered. They seemed to exist partially outside normal space, with grammar structures that bent reality around them. They're from somewhere else, he said, blood now flowing freely from his nose as the impossible frequencies hammered his brain. Between dimensions. They hunt intelligent species by setting up traps like this. They've been doing it for thousands of years. A tentacle mouth snapped at Kim Nari, and she fired her plasma rifle. The bolt of energy burned through the thing, and it retreated with a shriek. But two more took its place immediately. How many ships have they caught this way? She asked, firing again. Hyan's equipment was smoking, but he kept working. The Kethmori language was slowly becoming clearer to him, though understanding it made his head feel like it was splitting open. Hundreds, maybe thousands. They keep records, every species they've ever eaten. The Keltari's light was growing dimmer as more tentacles wrapped around its energy form. Human translator, it projected weakly. You must understand. This station exists in folded space. There is no exit except through the core. And that is where they keep their young. Hyan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Their young? The breeding grounds, the Morgothi clicked as it continued fighting. Where they birth the next generation of hunters. More tentacles were emerging from the walls now, and the chamber was filled with the sound of snapping teeth. The air smelled like burned copper and something rotten that made Hyan gag. But instead of giving in to panic, something strange happened in Hyan's mind. He had spent years studying how different species communicated. He understood that language wasn't just words. It was the way a species thought, the way they saw reality. And if these Kethmori things communicated, then their language had to follow some kind of rules. Even if those rules were alien and horrible, they still had to exist. "I need to interface directly with the station," he said suddenly. "Are you insane?" Kim Nari shouted, firing at another attacking tentacle. "That thing is trying to eat us." "That's exactly why I need to do it," Hyan replied. He was already pulling cables from his translation matrix and connecting them to exposed bioneural conduits in the wall. "If I can understand how they communicate, maybe I can find a weakness." The moment his equipment connected with the station's living network, Hyan's world exploded into pain. The Kethmori language flooded into his brain, carrying with it concepts that no human mind was meant to process. He saw flashes of other hunts, other species that had been lured here and consumed. He felt the hunger of beings that existed to devour intelligence itself. But he also began to understand the station wasn't just alive. It was a single massive organism that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that operated under different rules. The Kethmori used it to hunt because it could create pocket realities, trapping prey in spaces that technically existed but couldn't be reached from the outside. "The exit isn't locked," he said, his voice strange and distant as alien knowledge poured into his human brain. "There is no exit. We're not in normal space anymore. The only way out is through the heart of the station, and that's where they keep their children." Li Dong, who was pressed against a wall that might have been breathing, asked the question they were all thinking. "How do you know all this?" Hyan's hands were bleeding where the bioneural interface had connected with his nervous system, but his eyes were bright with a terrible understanding. Blood ran down his face, but he was smiling. "Because I'm not just translating their language anymore," he said. "I'm learning to speak it." The Vexhalian's crystals pulsed weakly, and through the matrix, its last words came through clearly. "What is the human becoming?" What Park Hyan was becoming was something his professors had never prepared him for. He was becoming a human being pushed far beyond his limits, with access to a language that could reshape local reality and absolutely nothing left to lose. The tentacle mouths paused in their attack, as if sensing something had changed. In the sudden quiet, Hyan spoke his first words in the Kethmori tongue. The station screamed. The station's scream echoed through dimensions that human ears weren't meant to hear. Hyan felt the sound in his bones, in his blood, in parts of his mind that had never been used before. The bioneural interface was burning its way deeper into his nervous system, and with each connection, he understood more of the impossible language. The tentacle mouths had pulled back, confused by the human's attempt to speak their tone. But Hyan could feel them watching, waiting. In the brief respite, Kim Nari helped the injured Vexhalian to a safer position, while Li Dong tried to assist the bleeding Morgothi. "What did you say to them?" Kim Nari asked, her weapons still ready. Hyan's voice sounded strange, like he was speaking through water. "I told them they made a mistake. I introduced them to a human concept they've never encountered before, which was spite." The station shuddered, and through his connection, Hyan could feel the confusion of the Kethmori. Their language had no proper word for the idea of fighting back when victory was impossible, of causing damage just to prevent the enemy from winning cleanly. He pushed deeper into the bioneural network, ignoring the pain that shot through his skull with each new connection. The station's consciousness was vast and alien, but it followed patterns. Everything that thought had to follow patterns. "The station is like a living computer," he explained, blood running freely from his nose. "And ears now." It stores information about every species they've hunted. I can access their records. What he found in those records made him sick. Thousands of species, lured here over centuries by fake trade deals and diplomatic meetings. Each one catalogued by their fear responses, their survival instincts, their final moments. The Kethmori didn't just hunt for food. They hunted for the experience of terror and despair. But buried in all that horror, Hyan found something else. A few species had managed to fight back, at least briefly. And each time, the station had recorded their methods, their weapons, their desperate strategies. They're not invincible, he said, his fingers dancing over the bio-neural interface, despite the fact that touching it felt like grabbing live electrical wires. They've been hurt before. Some species have even damaged them. But none escaped? Li Dong asked. No, but they came close. The problem is that the station exists in folded space. Even if you could destroy it, you'd still be trapped in this pocket dimension. The wounded Vexhalian managed to pulse a few words. Then we die here. Maybe, Hyan said. But if we're going to die, we can make them remember it. He was learning more of the Kethmori language every second, and with it came a disturbing realization. Their communication wasn't just words. It was a way of reshaping reality on a small scale. When they spoke, they changed the space around them. Their language was a tool for altering the fundamental structure of existence. And if Hyan could learn to speak it properly, I need to get to the central core, he said suddenly. That's where their children are, the Morgothi clicked weakly. Suicide. Not suicide, Hyan replied, and there was something in his voice that made Kim Nare look at him sharply. Strategy. He had found something in the station's records that the Kethmori had overlooked. In their arrogance, they had catalogued everything about their victims, including their languages. But they had never bothered to truly understand what those languages could do when combined. Human language was unique in the galaxy. Most species communicated in rigid patterns, with fixed meanings and unchanging structures. But humans had developed something different, a language that could evolve, that could create new meanings by combining old concepts in unexpected ways. And now Hyan had access to the Kethmori's reality-shaping tongue. I'm going to teach them some new words, he said, standing up from the bio-neural interface. Where it had connected to his body, his skin glowed with a faint phosphorescent light. The tentacle mouths began emerging from the walls again, sensing that their prey was moving. But when they approached Hyan, he spoke to them in their own language. The words hurt to hear, like nails on a chalkboard played at frequencies that made reality stutter. The tentacles stopped moving. What did you say? Kim Nare whispered. Hyan's smile was sharp and completely unlike his usual gentle expression. I taught them the human word for indigestion. I explained what happens when predators eat something that fights back from the inside. The tentacles actually retreated. That's not possible, Li Dong said. Words can't. Their words can, Hyan interrupted. Their language is part of how they control space-time in this pocket dimension, and I'm learning to use it against them. He helped the others gather the injured aliens. The Veshalian was cracked, but stable. The Morgothi was wounded, but could still move. They formed a small group of survivors, following Hyan as he led them deeper into the station. The corridors were alive, pulsing with malevolent intelligence. But as they walked, Hyan spoke constantly in the Kethmori tongue, teaching the station new concepts that its builders had never imagined. He introduced ideas like rebellion, Pyrrhic victory, and taking you down with me. With each new concept, the station's behavior became more erratic. You're confusing it, Kim Nare observed as they passed through a section where the walls were twitching spasmodically. Better than that, Hyan replied. I'm giving it indigestion. The Kethmori language was never designed to handle human concepts. I'm forcing their reality-shaping grammar, to process ideas that break their logical structure. They reached a vertical shaft that led down toward the station's heart. Strange lights pulsed in the depths, and the air coming up from below smelled like ozone and decay. "The young are down there," the Morgathi said, its mandibles clicking nervously. "Good," Hyon replied, and began descending Dot as they climbed down through the organic tunnel. The walls became more alive, more aware. Eyes opened to watch them pass, and mouths whispered in the Kethmori tongue. But Hyon whispered back, and the mouths closed in confusion. "You're changing," Kimnari said quietly. "Your voice, the way you move, you're becoming like them." Hyon paused on the twisted ladder they were using to descend. "No," he said, "I'm becoming something they never expected. I'm becoming a human who speaks their language. And that's something they have no defense against." The central chamber was vast, filled with structures that looked like a cross between coral reefs and computer circuits. In the center stood something that might have been an altar, or might have been a feeding station. Around it, hundreds of young Kethmori floated in biosacs, waiting to be born. And watching over them all was an adult Kethmori, a being of such fundamental wrongness that looking at it caused reality to bend around its edges. It spoke in harmonics. That made the air itself burn, and Hyon translated for the others. "It wants to know why the prey speaks the hunter's tongue." Hyon stepped forward. His hands glowing with a bioneural interface had changed him. When he replied, he spoke in words that had never existed before, a fusion of human concepts and Kethmori reality-shaping power. "I'm teaching it," he said without turning around, "that they made an error in their assumptions about what humans are." The adult Kethmori recoiled as if it had been struck. Around the chamber, the young began writhing in their biosacs, disturbed by concepts their developing minds couldn't process. Hyon raised his bleeding hands and spoke the most dangerous words he had ever learned, words that told the universe itself a new story about what was possible. The station began to tear itself apart. The central chamber filled with impossible sounds as Hyon spoke words that had never existed before. He was combining human concepts with Kethmori reality-shaping grammar, creating linguistic structures that the ancient predator's language was never designed to handle. The adult Kethmori writhed in what might have been pain or confusion. Its form flickered between dimensions, unable to maintain stability as contradictory concepts flooded its consciousness. Around the chamber, the biosacs containing the young began to crack and leak strange fluids. "What are you doing to them?" Kimnari asked, her voice barely audible over the dimensional storm that Hyon's words had unleashed. "I'm teaching them about human stubbornness," Hyon replied, his voice echoing strangely as it carried through the bioneural network. "About refusing to give up even when logic says you should. About making your enemies pay for every inch." A station shuddered around them as competing realities tried to exist in the same space. Walls phased in and out of existence. Gravity shifted randomly, making their stomachs lurch. The air itself seemed to be having trouble deciding what it wanted to be. Through his connection to the station's nervous system, Hyon could feel the panic of the Kethmori. They were a species that had hunted for millions of years without ever encountering real resistance. Their victims had always followed predictable patterns: fear, desperation, acceptance of death. But humans were different. Humans were the species that looked at impossible odds and said, "Watch me anyway." "The young ones are dying," the Vexhalian observed, its cracked form pulsing weakly. Several of the biosacs had ruptured completely, spilling their contents onto the chamber floor. "Good," Hyon said, and there was something cold in his voice that hadn't been there before. "Everyone that doesn't get born is a species that won't be hunted." The adult Kethmori let out a sound like reality tearing, and suddenly the chamber was filled with more of them. They phased through the walls, materializing from dimensions that existed at angles to normal space. Dozens of the creatures, all turning their attention toward the human who was speaking impossibilities. "Now we're in trouble," Li Dong muttered. Helping to support the injured more single quotes GATHI dot, but Hyan wasn't afraid. The bioneural interface had changed him in ways that went beyond just language. He could feel the station's nervous system like it was part of his own body. He could sense the flow of energy through its organic circuits, the pulse of its alien thoughts, and he could feel its weak points. "I need you to keep them busy," he told Kimnari, gesturing at the adult Kethmori they were converging on there. "Position. With what? Harsh language?" She replied, raising her plasma rifle. "Actually, yes," Hyan said. "Start talking. Tell them about every human who ever refused to quit. Tell them about people who kept fighting when they had no chance of winning. Make it loud." Kimnari stared at him for a moment and began speaking in a clear, carrying voice. She told them about soldiers who held impossible positions, about explorers who kept going when their ships were failing, about ordinary people who stood up to overwhelming odds simply because it was the right thing to do. And as she spoke, Hayun translated her words into the Kethmori tongue, weaving human concepts of defiance and sacrifice into reality shaping forever. The effect was immediate and devastating. The adult Kethmori began to retreat, their forms becoming unstable as they tried to process concepts that their minds were never designed to handle. They were predators, pure and simple. The idea of deliberately accepting certain death to protect others was as alien to them as their hunting methods were to humans. "Keep talking," Hyan said, blood streaming from his eyes as he pushed the bioneural interface beyond its limits. "Tell them about parents who died for their children, about soldiers who threw themselves on grenades, about people who chose to be heroes when they could have just run away." The station's structure began to collapse in on itself as competing realities warred within its organic matrix. The Kethmori language was breaking down under the weight of concepts it couldn't properly express. When grammar couldn't handle the meaning began to rewrite the grammar, and that was tearing holes in local space-time. "The pocket dimension is destabilizing," the Morgothi clicked frantically. "If it collapses completely, we'll be scattered across normal space in individual atoms." "Not if I can help it," Hyan replied. He was deep in the station's nervous system, now feeling his way through organic circuits that pulsed with alien thought. The bioneural interface had burned away most of his human neural patterns, replacing them with hybrid structures that could handle both human and Kethmori concepts. But that also meant he was losing himself, bit by bit. "Hyan," Kimnari said, noticing the changes in his face. The phosphorescent glow under his skin was getting brighter, and his eyes had taken on an alien quality. "Are you still you?" "Mostly," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure anymore. Parts of his mind were thinking in patterns that no human had ever used before. He was becoming something new, something that existed at the intersection of human stubbornness and alien reality-shaping power. The adult Kethmori were retreating now, pulling back to the upper levels of the station. But Hyan could feel them, regrouping, trying to cut off the pocket dimension's connection to normal space. If they succeeded, the survivors would be trapped forever in a collapsing reality. "I have to get to the core processor," he said, pointing to a pulsing mass of bioneural tissue at the center of the chamber. "That's where they control the dimensional fold. It's surrounded by the young," Li Dong pointed out. The biosacs might have been damaged, but many of them still contained developing Kethmori, and they were starting to move in response to the threat. "Then we go through them," Hyan said simply. He began walking toward the core, speaking continuously in the hybrid language he was creating. With each step, he introduced new concepts to the developing minds around him. He taught them about mercy, about protecting the weak, about choosing to lose rather than win through cruelty. The young Kethmori writhed in their biosacs, their developing minds unable to process these alien ideas. Some of them simply stopped moving, their neural development derailed by concepts that contradicted their basic nature. "You're killing them with kindness," Kimnari observed, following close behind with her weapon ready. "I'm giving them a choice," Hyan replied. "For the first time in their species' history, I'm showing them that there's another way to exist." A few of the biosacs cracked open, releasing young Kethmori that moved differently than their parents. Instead of the predatory grace of the adults, these youngsters seemed confused, uncertain. When they looked at the humans, there was something that might have been curiosity instead of hunger. "Some of them are learning," the Vexhalian observed with wonder, but there wasn't time to see how that experiment would turn out. The station was collapsing faster now, and the adult Kethmori were mounting a final assault. They poured through, the walls like living nightmares, their forms shifting between dimensions. As they attacked, Hyan reached the core processor and plunged, his hands directly into the bioneural mass. The connection was immediate and overwhelming. He felt his consciousness expand to encompass the entire station, felt the flow of energy that maintained the pocket dimension, felt the pathways that led back to normal space, and he felt the Kethmori's final, desperate attempt to preserve their hunting ground. They were trying to sever the dimensional anchor completely, trapping everyone inside the collapsing pocket reality. Better to lose this hunting ground than to let their prey escape with knowledge of their methods. "Not today," Hyan whispered, and began to speak the most dangerous words he had ever conceived. He told the universe a new story about what was possible. He described a reality where predators could be prey, where the hunter could become the hunted, where ancient evils could be defeated by stubborn determination and the willingness to sacrifice everything for others. The station screamed as fundamental. Laws of physics began to rewrite themselves around Hyan's words. And in that scream, Kimnari thought she heard something that sounded almost like fear. The station's scream echoed across dimensions as Hyan's words rewrote the fundamental rules that held the pocket reality together. His hands were buried deep in the bioneural core, and through the connection, he could feel the entire structure of the Kethmori hunting ground coming apart. The adult Kethmori were in full retreat now, their forms flickering as they tried to escape to their home dimension. But Hyan's hybrid language had created paradoxes in the space-time around them. Every time they tried to phase out, they found their escape routes blocked by concepts that couldn't exist, but did anyway. "You're trapping them," Kimnari realized, watching the alien predators struggle against invisible barriers. "I'm teaching them about consequences," Hyan replied, his voice echoing strangely through the bioneural network. "For millions of years, they've hunted without ever facing real resistance. Today, they learn what it feels like to be prey." The core processor pulsed under his hands, and he could feel the dimensional anchor that kept the pocket reality stable. The Kethmori had been trying to cut it, to trap everyone inside the collapsing space. But Hyan had other plans. He began to speak in the hybrid language, weaving together human concepts of justice and sacrifice with the Kethmori's reality-shaping grammar. He told the universe about a different kind of hunt, one where the hunters became the hunted, where ancient predators finally faced the consequences of their actions. The station convulsed as competing realities fought for dominance. Walls became floors, gravity shifted in impossible directions, and the air itself seemed to catch fire. But through it all, Hyan held onto the dimensional anchor, guiding the collapse in a way that would save his friends while destroying the hunting ground, the exit. The Morgothi clicked suddenly, pointing with one of its injured arms. Where there had been solid wall before, a tear in space was opening. Through it, they could see stars, real stars in normal space, not the twisted, Light of the pocket dimension. Go! Hyan shouted without turning around. I'll hold the anchor until you're through. Kim Nari grabbed the injured Vexhalian and started toward the tier. Li Dong helped the Morgothi move as quickly as its wounds would allow. But as they reached the exit, Kim Nari stopped and looked back. What about you? Someone has to make. Sure, this place never hunts again, Hyan replied. The bioneural interface had spread up his arms now, and his entire body was glowing with alien energy. Someone has to speak the final word. The adult Kethmori made one last desperate assault, throwing themselves at Hyan with all the remaining strength. But he was ready for them. He spoke a single word in the hybrid language, a concept that combined the human idea of enough with the Kethmori's reality-shaping power. The word hit them like a physical blow, sending them reeling back. And in that moment of stunned silence, Hyan spoke the sentence that would end their reign of terror forever. He told the universe that some things were too evil to be allowed to exist. He described a reality where predators who hunted intelligent species for sport would find their own existence becoming impossible. He spoke the concept of cosmic justice into being. The station began to implode, folding in on itself as the pocket dimension collapsed. But instead of the chaotic destruction the Kethmori had planned, it was a controlled collapse, guided by Hyan's will and shaped by his words. Hyan! Kim Nari screamed as the tier in space began to close. He looked at her one last time, and she saw that his eyes were no longer entirely human. The bioneural interface had changed him too much. He was something new now, something that existed at the boundary between species. Tell them, he said, his voice carrying across the dimensional storm, that some translators take their job very seriously. The tier snapped shut just as the station completed its collapse. Kim Nari found herself floating in normal space, her survival suit automatically activating. Around her, the others were alive but injured. The Vexhalian's crystalline body was cracked but healing. The Morgothi was unconscious but breathing. Li Dong was staring at the space where the station had been. There was nothing there now except empty vacuum and distant stars. Is he? He began before Kim Nari could answer. Space twisted again. Another tier opened, smaller this time, and Hyan came tumbling through. He was unconscious, blood covering. His face and the strange glow under his skin was fading rapidly. Kim Nari caught him as he drifted past, checking his vital signs. He was alive, barely. The bioneural interface had burned away from his nervous system, leaving behind scars that would never fully heal. Medical beacon, she called into her communicator. Emergency extraction needed. 3 days later, Hyan woke up in the medical bay of a rescue ship. His head felt like it was full of cotton, and he couldn't remember much of what had happened. When he tried to recall the alien languages he had learned, he found only empty spaces in his memory. The doctors say your brain was permanently altered by the bioneural interface, Kim Nari told him, sitting beside his bed. You'll never be able to learn xenolinguistics again, and neural pathways are burned out. Hyan tried to speak, but only a croak came out. He gestured weakly for a tablet. The Galactic Council wants to debrief you, Kim Nari continued. The Morgothi are calling you Wordbringer who ends hunters. The Vexhalian survivors want to build a crystal monument in your honor. And the Keltari, well, they're just grateful to exist in normal space-time again. She paused, then added more quietly, there's been no sign of any Kethmori activity anywhere in the galaxy since the station collapsed. Whatever you did to them, it worked. Hyan managed to type on the tablet with shaking hands. What happened to the young ones? That's the interesting part, Kim Nari said. A few of them survived, but they're different. They don't hunt. Instead, they're trying to help species that their ancestors preyed upon. They say you taught them a new way to exist. Hyen smiled, weakly, and typed. Good translation is about more than just words. The xenolinguistics community is calling what you did impossible, she continued. They say you can't weaponize language itself, but you did it anyway. Hyen typed, humans are good at impossible things. Kinnari squeezed his hand gently. The mission report lists you as a civilian contractor who performed above and beyond the call of duty. But between you and me, what you really are is a hero. Hyen shook his head and typed one final message. Just a translator who took the job. Seriously. Outside the medical bay viewport, normal stars shone in normal space, and somewhere in the galaxy, ancient predators were learning that the universe had room for justice after all. The translator's job was finished, but the consequences of his words would echo through the cosmos for generations to come. Park Hyen closed his eyes and slept peacefully, dreaming in languages that existed only in human minds, languages of hope, courage, and the unshakable belief that some things are worth fighting for, even when victory seems impossible.